June 23rd, 1957. Dear Olga, as I was reading Mao's revelations on how contradictions continue to exist under the People's Republic, with even people redefined, I remembered Leontiev's admission that values still operated in Russia, with even Chapter 1 of Capital redefined as something of the past. But while it is true that Mao does with the philosophical concept of contradiction the very same thing that Leontiev did with the economic concept of value, somewhere in a footnote in Volume 1, Marx laughs at the bourgeois philosopher for understanding every sort of senseless contradiction, but being a stranger to the Hegelian contradiction, which is the source of all dialectic. This is 1957, not 1943, and it is China, not Russia. What is new in the date and the country is what we have to grapple with. In 1943, Russia was about to win a war and was telling its workers that there will be no difference in the conditions of labour. In 1957, the whole world, even the dominant rulers who are aiming for war if that is what is needed for world mastery, are scared senseless that they might all be blown off the earth. In a way it bears a parallel to the rise of Nazism when the Depression so shook up the world and the workers were in such a violent revolt that even fascism had to call itself National Socialism. Moreover, state capitalism in an industrial country is one thing, and something else again in so vast and underdeveloped country as China. Mao says 5 million of its 6 million population is peasant. They must still talk about their bowl of rice and ask the bourgeois intellectuals' collaboration, something like some of the Tsarist officers who were given a place under political leadership of the Communist Party in Russia in those bitter communist war years. Philosophically, it is a very great advance indeed for Mao to put contradiction, even though he makes it meaningless by his application to all so it applies to none, in the centre of his speech. Grace Lee Boggs didn't go beyond that in her philosophic section, neither in Dialectics and the Fate of Humanity in 1947, when the revolution was in the air, nor in 1950 when Hegel got put into our thesis only to have him equivalent to development through contradiction, while the age of absolutes remained an abstraction. The new article in the Russian Journal of Philosophy suddenly took issue with Hegel, and claimed Marx considered the unity of opposites as greater than negativity, denying the Hegelian negation of the negation as central to Marx. I said then, wasn't it peculiar that they all bandy about unity of opposites so freely, just in order to evade the resolutions of the contradictions and face the absolute idea? Mao now says Lenin said some marvellous things on contradictions. It only goes to prove that what was central for Lenin in 1915 is not for us today, except as methodology. Nothing, absolutely nothing short of absolute idea are the communists afraid of anymore. How we have them beat now. If you will bear with me, we will, before we reach Mao and the special place Hegel assigned to him in the spirit and self-estrangement, go through the previous stages of alienation. Number 1. In self-consciousness, the unhappy consciousness or alienated soul arises as, begin quote, personality confined within its narrow self and its petty activity, a personality brooding over itself as unfortunate as it is pitiably destitute, end quote. Hegel continues on the very next page, begin quote, through these moments, the negative abandonment first of its own right and power of decision, then of its property and enjoyment, and finally the positive moment of carrying on what it does not understand, it deprives itself, completely and in truth, of the consciousness of inner and outer freedom, or reality in the sense of its own existence for itself, end quote. I have brought this down, in the footnote in the book, to a description of the ex-radicals who can find no place for themselves either in or outside of the bourgeois fold, and end up on the green couch. You can put characters you yourself know and get your own illumination. Number 2. In reason, alienation takes the form of, begin quote, the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit, end quote. Begin quote. The heart-throb for the welfare of mankind passes therefore into the rage of frantic self-conceit, into the fury of consciousness to preserve itself from destruction, and to do so by casting out of its life the perversion which it really is, and by straining to regard and to express the perversion as something else, end quote. If not C.L.R. James, then any faint-hearted Marxist or Labour bureaucrat will do, including Khrushchev. Number 3. But Mao doesn't appear until Spirit and Self-Estrangement, the discipline of culture, which constructs not merely one world, but a twofold world, divided and self-opposed. And just look how Hegel follows Mao through with his discovery of the contradiction so long as there is unity. Begin quote. The equilibrium of the whole is not the unity which abides by itself, nor its inwardly secured tranquillity, but rests on the estrangement of its opposite. The whole is therefore, like each single moment, a self-estranged reality. End quote. And 2 pages further on, Hegel continues, begin quote. The sphere of spirits at this stage break up into 2 regions. The one is the actual world, that is self-estrangement. The other is that which spirit constructs for itself in the ether of pure consciousness, raising itself above the first. This second world, being constructed in opposition and contrast and estrangement, is just on account not free from it." End quote. That is what Mao is blind to. He thinks he can construct two opposite worlds, and as soon as he assures it 100 flowers can bloom, even if he does deny any flower the right to be second party, which is bourgeois, thereupon he is assured his poverty-stricken land unity. Marx, in his critique of the Hegelian dialectic, where he speaks of how many fields of exploration lay hidden in Hegel if only critically understood, points precisely to the spot which Hegel calls the noble type of consciousness. At another place Hegel says, begin quote, "This type of mind is the heroism of service," end quote. And finally, begin quote, "Such a type is the haughty vassal. He is active in the interest of the state power," end quote. Begin quote. This estrangement, however, takes place in language, in words alone, and language assumes here its peculiar role. It is the power of utterance qua utterance which, just in speaking, performs what has to be performed. Speech, however, contains this ego in its purity. It alone expresses I itself." End quote. It is equivalent in economic terms to the fetishism of commodities which kept even classical political economy, which had discovered labour as a source of value, its prisoner. Throughout that remarkable first chapter in Das Kapital, Marx keeps talking of the perverse relationship under capitalism where dead labour dominates living labour. In Hegel, begin quote, this entire sphere of perversion, end quote, of the spirit and self-estrangement ends with, begin quote, this type of spiritual life is the absolute and universal inversion of reality and thought. Their entire estrangement the one from the other. It is pure culture. What is found out in this sphere is that neither the concrete realities, state, power and wealth, nor their determinate conceptions, good and bad, nor the consciousness of good and bad, the consciousness that is noble and the consciousness that is base, possess real truth. It is found that all these moments are inverted and transmuted the one into the other, and each is the opposite of itself." End quote. That opposite Mao did not grasp, nor could he, since the state he is the leader of has its own dialectic of development, irrespective of the noble consciousness of its leader. Just as every single thing has its own dialectic of development, so the various stages of alienation go through their transformations. Or rather, vice versa, since, begin quote, the moving and creating principle, end quote, to use Marx's expression for the principle of negativity, is its very negativity. Neither Khrushchev nor Mao can escape this, but that each has tried a different aspect of it because of the compulsion from the objective movement to the subjective aspirations of their working people denotes the true absolute of our age, the counter-revolution in the very innards of revolution and that is the vision, the revolution in the innards of their counter-revolutionary states. Wait till the book Marxism and Freedom appears and we go to battle.